From a historicist point of view, it can be said that Prophet Daniel has been in the critics' den for more than a century. Not only does modern scholarship believe that the book was written much later than it claims to be, and by another person than the prophet Daniel, but it claims that the very message of the book is actually not about the kingdoms that Daniel seems to be speaking about, but a special focus on Antiochus IV, a Seleucid king that, according to the books of Maccabees, persecuted the Jews and profaned their temple in the 2nd century before Christ. The strongest evidence for this view of the book of Daniel is without a doubt chapter 11, which modern scholarship agrees accurately describes historical events up to Antiochus Epiphanes IV and the surrounding events. At the same time, the historicist view of Daniel is rather unknown by our church members for the very simple reasons that while we have a strong consensus on the former chapters, the visions of chapter 2, 7, 8, 9, when we come to chapter 11, we don't really have a consensus on the meaning of the chapter as a whole. We therefore encourage everyone to watch this video series that we have made to get more acquainted with the basics of the interpretation of Daniel according to historicism and according to modern critical scholarship. Now, the book of Daniel contains 3 major visions and 2 further angel interpretations. The major visions are found in chapter 2, 7, and 8. What is interesting about the visions is that the first one, as I said, is in chapter 2. Then we have the vision of chapter 7, which builds on chapter 2. And the third vision in chapter 8 builds on the 2 previous ones. Then we have 2 more angel explanations in chapter 9, and then again in the last chapters of the book, 10 through 12. And they explain the last vision, that of chapter 8. The school of prophetic interpretation known as historicism takes each of the major visions as a forecast of the course of history from the time of prophet Daniel to the very eschaton. To be more specific, each vision outlines the course of history through the succession of 4 major world powers, beginning with Babylon in the time of Daniel, then Medo-Persia, Greece, and finally Rome, which always receives a special focus in the visions of Daniel. Given this interpretational framework of historicism, historicism sees the last explanation, that given in chapters 10 through 12, mostly in the 11th chapter, as covering the same ground as the first visions, and thus historicism anticipates we're going to cover the same ground here. We're going to go through the same kingdoms, and we're going to have a similar focus on the last empire, or Rome. Now, notice that in this school of thought, chapter 11 is a literal explanation by the angel Gabriel, who is sent to prophet Daniel to explain to him what he has seen up so far, mostly in symbolical visions and dreams. Now, what we are going to do is that we are going to cover one of the historicist interpretations. I don't know if you noticed, but the title of this series is A Historicist Interpretation of Daniel 11. That's because there is not a consensus, so we cannot really call any single variation the historicist interpretation. We decided that the one we are going to focus on in this series is the one written by Uriah Smith. He was one of the Seventh-day Adventist pioneers, and he authored the first major Daniel commentary for the Seventh-day Adventists. It was very influential, mostly because what he did in his commentary is that he was synthesizing the common consensus of his church. So when we read his explanation of Daniel 11, we are really just seeing what the church believed up to that time and for the following decades, really almost for like a whole century. There wasn't really a consensus on the last verses 40 through 45, So that explanation part is really Uriah's contribution. And even that came to be generally accepted in the church more or less until the middle of the 20th century, when it was mostly abandoned by the church as a whole. Now, since Uriah used the King James Version, and it's kind of critical for some of the verses that he's going through, we will be following that translation through in this part of our Daniel series. So we begin with verse 2, where Gabriel begins his explanation of the visions that Daniel has seen. And now will I show thee the truth. Behold, there shall stand up yet 3 kings in Persia. To know who these 3 kings are, we first have to say, well, where are we counting from? We know, if we look at the beginning of chapter 10, that the vision in which this explanation occurs is given in the time of Cyrus the Great. If we count from Cyrus the Great, the next 3 kings were Cambyses, False Smerdis, and Darius the First. Now I want you to notice in this verse the phrase "to stand up." Uriah Smith takes this as meaning to begin to reign, whether a new kingdom or just succeed the former king. And this is going to appear later on in the chapter as well. Now let's finish the verse. And the 4th shall be far richer than they all, and by his strength, through his riches, he shall stir up all against the realm of Grecia. So the 4th king would be very rich, and he would use his strength, all of it, to invade Greece. The 4th king that succeeded the 3 kings already mentioned was Xerxes the First. He was far richer than the former Persian kings, and he is mostly known for his invasion into Greece. Herodotus, the famous Greek historian, says that his army numbered more than 5 million men, and Uriah Smith takes that as a verified historical source in this case. And Xerxes gathered many, many nations to fight with him against the Greeks. This invasion really marks the peak of Persian power when the 2 kingdoms are at war. After mentioning this peak in Persian power, Gabriel passes over the remaining Persian kings to mention the next world power which would succeed the kingdom of the Medes and the Persians. So let's look at verse 3. And a mighty king shall stand up that shall rule with great dominion and do according to his will. The king announced in this verse is Alexander the Great, as the description in the following verse is going to show, but we already have some hints in this very verse. For example, you notice the phrase "stand up," so this is a king that is beginning to reign. Now it might be the next Persian king, but it also might be a king that begins to reign or in a new kingdom. More than this, the king will, notice this phrase, do according to his will. In the book of Daniel, this phrase is already used in chapter 8, verse 4, where it is used to describe a new world power. So it stands to reason that the phrase is being used in the same meaning here. A new power is being introduced. Now notice that if we look here at verse 2 and verse 3, we're already starting to see a pattern at how Gabriel is going to cover history through the rest of the chapter. Notice that Gabriel mentions only few Persian kings until Artaxerxes, or the rich 4th king, and then Gabriel skips over a century, actually more than a century, to mention Alexander the Great. While Gabriel is describing history accurately, and he will be tracing history from the Persian Empire all the way down to the resurrection, his description is less than 50 verses. If you're going to cover more than 2,000 years of history in 50 verses, you're going to have to do some skipping, or you have to at least focus on major events, even though you're tracing them in sequence. So it's good to keep this in mind as we continue through the chapter. verse 4 sounds like this: "And as soon as he has arisen, his kingdom shall be broken and divided toward the four winds of heaven, but not to his posterity, nor according to the authority with which he ruled. For his kingdom shall be plucked up and go to others besides these." If I paraphrase the verse, shortly after the rise of this new kingdom, it will be broken towards the four winds of heaven. Now, the mention of four and division is important because it is always used with the kingdom of Greece in the book of Daniel. We see it in chapter 7, verse 6, and also in chapter 8, verse 8. And if we look at history, shortly after Alexander died, there started to be wars among his generals. Who would succeed as the new ruler? There was no single ruler who emerged as Alexander's successor. He had expanded the kingdom of Greece all the way to India in around a decade. So it was a very fresh empire and vulnerable when he died suddenly, as can be seen from the fact that his family got wiped out in the power struggle that continued. It continued for few decades, nearly half a century, and we know these struggles today as the Wars of the Diadochi, or Diadochi. During this long power struggle, four kingdoms emerged in the beginning, but then slowly they fought each other until they were less than that. That is why the text mentions four always in the beginning. Now, while these kingdoms were strong, not a single one of them was as strong, obviously, as the whole kingdom of Alexander the Great had been, as the text says, that this kingdom will not go to the posterity of the first king, nor will it have the same power as he had. If we go to verse 5 now, it reads, "Then the king of the south shall be strong, but one of his princes shall be stronger than he, and shall rule, and his authority shall be a great authority." Notice that the king of the south is mentioned here without really any previous introduction or any explanation of who he is. If we look closely at the first verse before, the verse number 4, we notice that Gabriel talks about the four directions or the four winds of the heaven, which obviously are north, south, east, and west. So the conception of the idea of north or south has indirectly already been introduced, and that's why Gabriel goes immediately to start to talk about one of the directions here, and he will then add north in the following verses. This still leaves us with the question, what is Gabriel's point of reference? South compared to what? North compared to what? As the following verses are going to show us clearly, the point of reference is Palestine. So keep that in mind. If we look at history after reading this verse, or verse 5, we can see that the four kingdoms that succeeded Alexander, they fought each other until only two were left. It was the Seleucid kingdom in the north and the Ptolemaic kingdom in the south, or basically in Egypt, which was the major territory of the kingdom of the south. After Alexander died, one of his generals, Ptolemy, gained possession of Egypt. Now, there were many generals at this time, and they were fighting each other, and one of them, or another one, was called Seleucus. He temporarily fled to Egypt and became one of the princes of Ptolemy for a while, and sought shelter there and was his subordinate, or as the text says, one of his princes. After he had served Ptolemy for a while, Seleucus tried again to gain territory for himself, and he became very successful at that, because eventually he ruled all the territory outside of the kingdom of the south. When the dust settled on the wars of the Diadochi, therefore we only have these two remaining kingdoms, the kingdom of Ptolemy in the south and the kingdom of Seleucus in the north. Now, what is interesting with these two kingdoms is that their border was mostly through the territory of what we call today Palestine. These two kingdoms would, for nearly a century, fight over who should be in charge of this territory, because both kingdoms laid claim to it. These series of wars are now known as the Syrian Wars. And the following verses in Daniel up till verses 14, 15, 16, 17 are going to continue describing this power struggle between the kingdom of the north and the kingdom of the south.